Patrick Sessums here with Due South Outfitters doing our Educated Angler series. We recently discussed how to rig a double nymph rig, and I wanted to take just a few minutes and talk about some really basic nymph fishing techniques when we're fishing suspension style with a strike indicator with two flies underneath it. We're on a tributary of the Yadkin River right now in North Carolina. Beautiful water, as you can tell. Nice, clear, gin clear water in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. And one thing that's going on here when I'm nymph fishing, I'm looking for a couple things. One, I'd be looking for a food source. Two, oxygen. And three, cover. So as we look at this run here, we've got great oxygenation. We've got, a nice kind of drop down above us here where the water's coming tumbling over the rocks. This makes for really nice oxygenation of the river here. We've got a nice little bubble seam. As far as food goes, a lot of aquatic insects like to live in riffles or shallow rocky areas. And so we've got a nice shallow rocky riffle above us just below this drop down, which will be putting basically food into the river for these trout. Another thing, cover, is as we look at this, we've got this shallow rocky shelf, our food source, then it drops off a bit into probably about a 4-foot deep hole here. These trout will lay right on the edge of the shelf looking for food to drift to them, basically. A lot of people don't realize this, but trout are ultimately looking upstream, waiting for food to drift to them to eat the food. It's kind of like a big conveyor belt of food, if you will. So our goal as anglers, as we're nymph fishing, is to cast our flies upstream at about a 45-degree angle and let our flies drift downstream to where they're about a 45-degree angle to kind of present those flies naturally to those fish as if they're actual bugs or food for the trout. So let's get started, guys. In order to fish this one run here, what I'll do, I'm gonna predominantly roll cast today. We've got a little bit of debris behind us and brush behind us, so I don't want to get caught up in that. I'm gonna have a little bit of fly line out here, my yellow line, out the end of my rod. Going to make a nice little roll cast, just really simple, out. And if you notice, I'm staying relatively tight between my strike indicator and my rod tip. What this does, it ensures that I've got a nice clean drift as I come through. One of the most common mistakes I see people making when they're nymph fishing is ultimately they've got too much slack between their flies and their rod. What happens when you have too much slack is it gives that trout a split second to ultimately eat your fly and be off without you being able to connect via a hook set. So as we fish, it'll be really important to manage your slack. Line management is probably one of the most key ingredients to becoming a successful angler in my eyes. Here's another trout. If you notice here, when I went to set the hook, I didn't have to lift very far. I ultimately just made a swift lift of my rod tip. Oh, lost that guy. And the trout was already there. That's where rod management, line management comes into play. So another common thing I see is a lack of mending. Let me kind of walk you guys through what mending is here. And if we take a second and look at our line, I'll show you a good drift to start with. Now let's take a second and look at a bad drift. Notice any differences. Ultimately, one of the biggest differences is what our line is doing. If you notice on the second drift, my line was downstream of my indicator. What this will do is it'll cause your flies to swing unnaturally through the water column. Those flies are being accelerated by the slack line, and in return, they're moving much faster than the natural rate of speed of the water. So I mentioned a terminology earlier called mending. Mending is ultimately taking your line and laying it above your strike indicator so that your fly is in front of your fly line. The reason we want to do this is to make sure that our flies are matching the natural pace of the river as they drift downstream. It's our goal as fly anglers to make our flies look as if they're drifting down the river, just like any other bug that's tumbling downstream. A couple tips on mending. I see quite a few mistakes in mending that people make as a guide every day. One of the biggest being they don't lift their line up. That would be a bad mend. Let's show a good mend. I like to lift my rod tip, tighten slightly, and fold my line. Notice how I really didn't move my strike indicator much there. Lift, fold, follow. Really easy method of mending there. Oh, there's another fish. Notice I keep my rod high here. This is called high sticking. What high sticking does is it allows you to fish over currents. So I'm currently fishing a kind of seam of fast water. However, there's slow water between us. That would slow my flies down if I had slack on the water there and make my flies not look natural to the trout. So by high sticking this, I'm reaching over the slow water, following my indicator down and matching the natural pace of the water. Once again, very little slack between my flies and my rod tip. So if I do get a strike, just a simple set and I'm hooked up. If you guys notice, one thing I'll do here at the end of my drift or toward the end of my lower 45 degrees that I'm fishing, I'm going to start lowering my rod tip slightly. What this does is it extends my drift a little further out. So that's one good rule of thumb. I'll see a lot of folks that'll prematurely recast. Let's make sure that as we're nymphing, we really let those flies go down below us and swing down, or swing out if you will. One of the best ways to do that is by lowering the rod tip at the end there. Another thing that's really important that I'd like to speak on is your grip. One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of people making when they're fly fishing is they're going to hold their line here in their left hand. A lot of times this is a kiss of death. Instead of having your line in your left hand here not connected on our cork, let's make sure we connect our line to our cork by putting our line through our trigger finger. That'll help in a couple ways. One is, after you set and you have your fish on, you can strip your fish in. And by stripping from your finger down, it ensures that you don't fumble. One of the biggest fumbles I see is, and then we spend a lot of time trying to grab line. Instead, let's always keep the line through our finger and strip simply from lifting to our finger and pulling down. To highlight a bad mend again, I see this quite a bit. Folks just simply roll their rod tip and kind of smack the water. That's actually not a mend. Instead, mending is a nice crisp lift, tighten, and fold the line with that indicator acting as a pivot point in which you fold it around. Once again, good mend. And bad mend. The lift is very important here, guys. Hopefully this has helped, guys. We know there's a lot of different ways to nymph fish, and we'll hopefully continue to highlight some other methods of nymph fishing or subsurface fishing. But this is a great way for somebody that's just getting into the sport to be able to go out and effectively fish subsurface. We really appreciate your time. Please, if you guys have anything great to say, or want to add anything to what we've, done here, please add it in the comments. We'd love to have feedback. And if there's anything you'd like for us to highlight on another video, please let us know. Until next time, we appreciate your time and tight lines. Thanks for joining us at The Educated Angler.